Hi, I'm Adam and I'm recording this video on chesswithkinetic.com. Today we're going to be discussing positions where one side has two split pawns and the other side's king is standing in front of them. So the first thing we need to note in this position is that white's king is very far away from the action. So if we try to bring our king in too quickly to support the pawns, then black will have time to simply capture both of our pawns. So this would be no good. So let's go back. So because of that, we need to find a new way to win this position. So I invite you to pause the video and try to come up with a winning plan for white. So the winning plan here for white is pawn to h5. And the idea here is that because of the positioning of both of white's pawns, they actually build a wall to stop black's king from directly approaching white's h pawn. So first of all, if black captures the f4 pawn, then white will simply push the h pawn, and black's king is too slow to stop it, and will queen and win the game. And secondly, and same thing if black's king goes to g4, the exact same idea, where black's king is too slow. Because whenever black's king gets behind the pawns, then we can just run. So because of this, black's king has to go backwards to f6 to try to go around the pawn to get in front of us. And because black isn't threatening anything in this position, only now we can start to bring our king up. If black's king comes up to f5, then again, because of the wall, it's not actually threatening anything. So we could just continue to bring our king up. So, and if black's king goes around to get in front of the pawns, here's the important idea in the position. Here we simply go f5, and we have the exact same setup we had in the original position. So whichever pawn black's king goes in front of, we can just push the other pawn to build our wall. So let's look at king h6, for example. Now after pawn to f6, black's king is again walled out from approaching the f pawn. And again, if it captures the h pawn, we can simply queen this pawn. So yes, again, we get the exact same idea repeated, where black's king has to go backwards. And now that black isn't threatening anything, we can start to bring our king up. And after king g8, we go for the exact same idea again, with pawn h6. And again, whichever pawn black's king approaches, we simply push the other one. And there's nothing black can do to stop us from queening on the next turn. So we'll get our pawn to the end of the board, promote to a queen, and win the game. So okay, let's move on to another example of this. So our second example is a little bit different. In this example, instead of there being one square in between the two pawns, there are now two squares in between the two pawns. So this changes stuff a little bit. So yes, again, if we simply run our king up the board, then black's king will be in time to get opposition in front of our e pawn. And if the king is in front of the pawn, and white's king isn't in front of their pawn, then this is a well-known draw, because black's king can simply stay on the e file. And when we go king f5, they'll go king f7, because to gain opposition. And after e6, king e7, king e5, king e8, king f6, king f8, e7, king e8, and now we'll see that this is stalemate. So for that reason, we can't just simply bring our king up the board, so we have to find a new idea. So again, we'll go e5, because now if black captures our h pawn, then yes, again, we'll be queening the other pawn, because the king will be too far away. So, but there's one key difference between this position and the previous position. Because this pawn is now further away from the h pawn, these two pawns together no longer make a wall to keep the king out. So now, when black's king can go king g6, and when we bring our king up after king f5, king g3, king e5, now you see that we're left with only the h pawn. And actually, for those of you who don't know, king versus edge pawns are actually very simple draws, provided the king can get back into the corner in front of the pawn. And the reason for this is because when the king gets to the corner in front of the pawn, we're actually not able to force it out of the corner, and in the end, we'll have to stalemate the king. or lose the pawn. And this is a draw. So in actuality, this endgame is a draw because black approaches this pawn. Because black gets in front of the H pawn instead of getting in front of the E pawn. So, okay. Keeping that in mind, let's look at a very, very similar example. So in this one, the only difference is that instead of starting in front of the H pawn, black's king is starting in front of the E pawn. And this actually makes a big difference because now this position is a win for white instead of a draw. And the reason it's a win is very simple. Now after we go H5 and black goes king F6, when we go for the exact same idea of bringing our king up the board, now instead of being left with a H pawn, we're instead left with an E pawn. So now when the king runs in front of the pawn, we actually will be able to force it out of the way. So, okay. So king G6, king E5, king F7, king here, king E6. And when your king gets to the 6th rank, it's actually a win no matter what square your opponent's king ends up on. So this is actually one example of where black gains opposition and white is still winning. And we'll queen our pawn. So the version where black was in front of the H pawn is a draw due to the fact that when black wins the E pawn, the king versus H pawn will be a draw. But the version where black's king starts in front of the E pawn is actually winning because black's king will then be left standing in front of the E pawn where we can force it out and promote to a queen. So, okay, let's look at one more example where white's pawns start slightly further up the board because this actually makes a big difference. So here's the same thing, but white's pawns are actually starting up one file further. So in the previous example, the pawns were on the 4th rank, and now the pawns are on the 5th rank. And this actually makes it much easier to win with white. And the reason this makes it much easier is because now actually, if we simply push the pawns, black's king isn't in time to stop both of them, and we'll win. Because we'll promote to a queen. So what this teaches us between these two positions is if the pawns are starting on the 4th rank or further back, then we can't just push the pawns to win the game. We have to instead bring our king in. But if the pawns are on the 5th rank or higher, then actually we don't even need to use our king at all because the pawns together will be too fast for the king to stop. So this has been a lesson about split pawns versus king. Thank you for watching and goodbye.